Hello, this is Dr. Shell Watts of MBAadmit.com. Welcome today. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that the GMAT Club is doing a giveaway. Um, you can win GMAT Club tests. To enter. All you have to do is like this video, post a comment, and then check the link in the description. So don't forget to do that. Um, it's great to be back here with the GMAT Club again. Today, the topic is for EMBA applicants. We want to walk you through some things to avoid, mistakes to avoid during the EMBA application process. And if you're able to avoid these, you're going to enhance your odds of getting into a great program. So originally we said 7 things we were going to focus on. As we sort of got into the writing, we sort of saw 9. So we're going to walk you through 9. And hopefully this will be some value added. Now, before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit more about our company. We've been doing advising for admissions for over 30 years. We have deep expertise with all the top EMBA programs. Since we've been doing this for so long, I certainly have worked with all the programs since the very first one began. The very first notable program was Wharton. And we've had success at all the top EMBA programs. When you work with our company, you will have the peace of mind that you work directly with me. So you won't have to think about, what editor you're working with and who is actually doing the editing and the advising. We do have a team of advisors, but your point of contact will always be me. Um, Going into this, and by the way, my background, for those of you that don't know it, I'm a graduate of Harvard and Oxford, and I also have Harvard admissions experience. Here we have a list of some of the programs we've had success with. But again, it's, the programs, the top ones in the USA, top ones in Europe, as well as Asia. And so, the wonderful thing about the EMBA programs these days is that so many of the schools have started it. There is a very big demand for the EMBA because, as you know, it means that you are able to get an MBA from a top school without stopping your job. For some people, it's just ideal. They've waited about 10 years, and in some ways, they may have aged out of the regular MBA pool. Some people don't want to stop a job. Some people have families. There's all sorts of reasons why you would prefer the EMBA track. And today, the programs are very sophisticated, very attractive, and these are some of the schools. Um, Feel free to contact us after this presentation if you would like us to take a look at your resume or your profile and give you feedback on what we think in terms of your odds and where you might be competitive. You can just go to our website and you'll see the link right there on the homepage. And then feel free to also access a free EMBA book, which is, again, you see the link right there on our website. You can go there and download that, and it has some wonderful articles about the process and tips for admissions. Now, as we just said, these are some of the benefits for the EMBA program. Many people find, they've been working for 8 to 15 years, and they really just want to get back into the learning of the best practices in a very structured way. So the EMBA offers the opportunity to tool up for the next level. For some people, it allows you to add a nice brand to your pedigree. And for others, it's redefining yourself because you may not have done very well in college, or maybe you went and got a degree from a school that you don't feel is very prestigious and doesn't reflect your caliber. So again, the EMBA gives you the opportunity to seek a degree from a top university. There's also the benefit of the lifelong learning that you get with the EMBA. After the program, you usually have access to webinars exclusive for graduates of the school. So there are a lot of wonderful reasons why you would pursue an EMBA. Let's just talk now about some mistakes to avoid in order to maximize your chances of getting a great outcome at a great school. So mistake number 1, this is one of the most dominant things that we see, is that candidates are convinced that they're either too young or too old, which correlates with the concern about not having enough experience or having too much experience. We find that these EMBA programs, especially since some of them are up and coming, they may be only 5 to 6 years old, they really just want fantastic candidates and students. And so they are typically open to working with people who are able to present themselves as very talented with great experience. At MBA Admit, our typical age for an EMBA candidate is between 28 and 44. We actually have most of them in the 28 and the 30s. Um, and even the person at 44 can be very successful at most of the top programs. Now, are you too old or too young based on a school? You need to actually go to the school and take a look at the website. Some of them actually do have minimum age requirements. Not all of them, though, but some of them do. Usually it's around 8 years. Sometimes it's a little more, 10 years. And so if they do have a minimum, they're not normally willing to work with that. So you would have to fall within that. But other than that, they're open. And so many of the top schools, whether it's Wharton or Columbia, they don't have that restriction on the work experience. And so people who are very young and also people who are very young can be very competitive for that program. So don't assume you're too young or too old. Go, first of all, find out if there's a minimum age requirement. I'm sorry, minimum work experience requirement. And then secondly, don't make the mistake, and some people do, of looking and seeing if some of the programs have said, we have a lot of directors. They start to think, okay, director means maybe 20 years out and, 50 years old, which is not the case. We get that a lot with people who are looking at MIT. In our experience, our candidates who are in their 30s are very successful getting into MIT. So, in some ways, I think the website there is not reflective of who actually can be competitive. So, just do your homework before you decide not to apply to certain schools based on age or breadth and length of experience. In terms of mistake number two, that would be assuming that a poor undergraduate record or a mediocre undergraduate record will close the door for you in admissions. We again find this is not true. And this is one of the major concerns that people have. Some people did not blossom in the college years. Some people weren't focused. Some people had to work their way through college. And there's all sorts of reasons why the GPA may not reflect your abilities or potential. The key thing to remember with the EMBA is that that college record was typically 8 to 15 years in the past. And so the admissions committee know better than to use that as the dominant reason to accept or reject someone. At the EMBA level, what they're most concerned about is what do they see in your career? Have you been very successful? Are you considered a super high performer in your workplace? Do you have ambitious goals for the future? They're much more concerned about your work experience or work success than how you did in college 8 to 15 years ago. Sometimes we do get candidates who know that they're overrepresented in the MBA pool and even in the EMBA pool, such as the Indian Foreign National Male Engineer or the East Asian Foreign National Male Engineer. And that candidate, when they approach me, they're still very concerned that if they didn't have first class distinction, they may not be competitive at a school like Wharton or Booth. And again, in our experience, that has not been true because the stellar work experience can eclipse that old credential. And so it really is your job in the application process to make sure that you put together a simply outstanding application that conveys the depth and the significance of your work experience and makes it very clear that you have a lot to contribute. So don't use an undergraduate record to self-select yourself out of some of the best programs. Certainly, maybe apply to a couple that are safer so you have options, but you certainly shouldn't exclude yourself from the very best programs that might be attractive to you. Now, ways to mitigate a low GPA, it's worth discussing that for just a little bit before we go on to mistake number three. But again, the application is extremely important. And so a big difference between some of these EMBA program applications and the MBA applications is that the EMBAs often have much more emphasis on leadership examples in the essays. And so the school, again, is signaling to you that your actual experience is much more important than the academic record that's so far back in time. If you do not use those essays well, then you are losing your prime opportunity to convey how significant your work experience is, how deep your leadership knowledge and teamwork best practice knowledge is. And that is one of the main things that was going to allow you to get into the school. So you need to pay a lot of attention to the essays and how you are using that to present your credentials. Another way to mitigate a low GPA is an alternative transcript. Now, some of you may or may not know what that refers to, but essentially, for those folks who have a record in undergrad that they are not happy with, a way to redirect attention away from that is to go take courses in person or online that are business relevant and ideally with a very reputable institution. So, for instance, Haas, which is UC Berkeley's business school, and UCLA are institutions that are known for having an excellent curriculum in their extension schools, which are essentially the online programs. And they'll offer you math courses, economics courses, business courses, strategy courses, operations. So there's a lot to choose from. You would go and take some of those. Now, if the record is really bad, it would be ideal to have 5 to 6 courses, perhaps. If it was just mediocre and not a major concerned, then maybe 2 or 3 courses. But the point is that you're giving them a metric much more recent that shows and attests to your strong skills. So that's a very useful technique that some people put into place when they are ready to try to mitigate that low GPA. Now, another thing that we want to talk about is the certifications. That is another effective way to, um, you know, redirect attention. Not all certifications are the same. So some of them are not going to weigh as heavily as others. One of the most prestigious, of course, is the CFA. And so you really do want to try to showcase that if you have that. That's a very rigorous a certification to get, and it's a big achievement to pass all 3 levels. So if you have something like that, that again can serve as a signal about where your skills are. Now, the GMAT score can also be a way to mitigate a low GPA. However, you don't want to necessarily use that route if the GMAT is not required at a school, because it's very, very hard to score well on a GMAT without putting a lot of time and effort into preparing. And so once you actually just take a look at the material and all the strategies that have to go into getting a really strong score, you know that you're looking at a couple of months of preparation time and a lot of input of time. So that is actually a very painful way to be trying to mitigate a low GPA. If the GMAT is required, then you have a great opportunity through the GMAT score to get that score to work for you in terms of redirecting attention, showing where your skills are. If it is not required, again, there's lots of other things you could do that would be less painful. The alternative transcript is one of those. So those are just things to keep in mind, strategies to implement to mitigate a low GPA. Mistake number 3, assuming a low GMAT score will close the door. Now, there's lots of reasons why a low GPA may not close the door for you. First of all, the GMAT is much less important at the EMBA level than at the full-time MBA level, and it's partly because um, the admissions committees know that at that level, at the place at which most people are when applying to an EMBA, people have very demanding jobs, they have families, and so they just don't have the time they need to put into studying for the GMAT. And so as a result, they'll get wonderfully qualified candidates who present 620 GMAT scores, 610, 600, and the schools have basically seen the disconnect between the score and all the other achievements. They've also noticed that when they let in someone with a 620 who has a great record otherwise, that candidate tends to do well in the program. And so they see that there's no correlation between that score and then the performance. And so many of the schools, for that reason, have just started phasing out the GMAT as a requirement. They just don't see it as relevant. And so you're going to see some really wonderful schools, MIT, Kellogg, Cornell, NYU, that don't require the GMAT for the EMBA admissions, which is wonderful news for most people. For those that still require the EMBA, the GMAT score for the EMBA application, what you're going to notice is that um, if you talk to the school, you say you get a score you're not very happy with and it's 620 or so, if you talk to the school will generally say, don't use that as the reason not to apply to us, because they're going to look at the broader package, and if everything else is very strong, they are going to consider you still very strongly. So in our experience, people with 620s can still get into most of the programs. One of the most picky programs is Wharton. And so I would never be telling someone with a 620, 630, 640 to take for granted that an admissions can happen. It may happen, but Wharton does tend to be one of the pickier schools. So again, don't self-select yourself out if you find that you get a score you're not happy with, and that you find that you can't get the score up because you don't have the time to study. One other thing to make mention of is because a lot of these schools have noticed that the GMAT score does not correlate with success or abilities. In the case of many EMBA applicants, a new test has been developed by the same organization that puts out the GMAT. And that new test is called the Executive Assessment. Now, not many schools are taking this yet. Among the ones that do are Chicago Booth and Columbia. But the good news is that it does not take as much time to prepare for that. And so it's wonderful that you would be able to have that alternative to, maybe study for 2 or 3 weeks and then do very well. And then, that's satisfying their standardized test requirement. So it's something that you really should look into if you have the option of taking that instead. I find the math on that to be extremely easy. It might be tedious, but very easy. And so most people would actually have a pretty easy time scoring well on that exam. Mistake number 4, failing to prepare well for the resume review and the early interview. Now, this is a very big one because some of the schools will tell you to submit your resume to them early, and they'll let you know what they think in terms of whether or not you might be viable as a candidate. The problem of doing that without preparing is that sometimes your resume is not done to the highest standard. Maybe it's also not including some of the things that are important for admissions, because the admissions resume is a little different than the job resume. So if you submit something that is not putting your best foot forward, first of all, that will end up in your file for the admissions file. Secondly, you're going to establish an impression, and you don't want to establish a bad impression. So you really do want to rethink, is the resume that you have serving you well? Do you need to get a good overhaul? Do you need to get feedback on how to make it stronger? And so use that opportunity to present the resume to put yourself on good footing, not on a bad first footing. The second thing is that the early interviews that some of these schools do, which actually takes place before you actually submit your application, is in some cases the only interview that you will have. And so again, you need to make sure that that's working for you. You need to make sure that you're able to talk about why the program's right and give some really good details, that you should be able to communicate your short-term goals and long-term goals in ways that are compelling for them. And so that's not something that typically most people will be able to do well if they have not given it a lot of foresight. So these are two huge opportunities that you have to position yourself well for admissions, that many people, they're just not aware of how important it can be. And so they go into it really not prepared. So this is a big warning for you to take it seriously and to know that this is a great opportunity and you should be maximizing that opportunity. Mistake number 5, um, indicating that you want to change careers in the short term. Now, many candidates that we get, I'd almost say over 60%, want to change careers. And the EMBA, that's why they're looking at the EMBA, is that they feel like it'll tool them up and then give them an opportunity to make a change. Now, while that may be true for them, there are some schools that if you write that in the application, you will most likely get rejected. And so you need to be aware of which of those schools, what are those schools, which ones, and then make a decision about, is that something you just don't present in the application process so that you make sure you get in the school. But another thing that's really important about that is that a very small minority of the schools, because they really don't want you to change your job, will not allow you to use their career services in the short term. So during the program, they'll say that, that's not something you have access to. So you need to be aware of that, know what their policy is on with regard to their career services, and then make a decision about, if they're firm about they don't want you to change careers, but you really do want to change careers, is that going to be the right program for you? Now, happily, it's a minority of schools that really don't want to see you change jobs. Most of them are clear that, and it's two things: it's changing jobs, and then it might be changing industry. And so even changing a job can be a concern for some of the schools. And so, and by that I mean changing companies. It's fine to go within your own company to a different job or even a different function, but to actually change a company, for some schools, they don't want to hear that you're planning to do that. So just, do your homework and know what you can present to each of the schools, and do your homework in particular if you are looking to use the career services for an institution, because you don't want to find that you don't have access in the short term to that given the policies of the school. Mistake number 6: um, failing to demonstrate the excellence of your performance, your work experience, and the breadth of your skills. Now, as I said, this is one of the main criteria. This set is among the most important criteria that you have to present and do it well in order to have a great outcome in the EMBA admissions process. So make sure that as you write your resume, as you write the actual application form, as you compose the essays, that you are making sure you're doing a top notch job of how you're presenting this information, because we've seen some applicants who have pretty, low level sounding titles. For instance, just project manager does not sound like it's very advanced. Now that one candidate just presenting essays that are okay and not really fleshing out that they know great leadership best practices and great teamwork skills, that candidate may fall flat in part because of that title and the person sounds a little bit low. But we could have the very same candidate and work with them to just generate an outstanding essay or two focused on leadership, where they go into great depth and they communicate how much they know in terms of leading, directing, inspiring, negotiating, influencing. That same candidate will look totally different to the school. So you really need to really pay attention to those essays. How are you communicating what you have? Make sure you're doing an outstanding job. Think of it as your marketing package, and it's your opportunity to convince them that if they put you in the classroom, you will be a great contributor to discussion, that other people can learn from your experiences and your knowledge. So don't underestimate how significant the actual application is. Mistake number 7 would be underutilizing your recommendations. This is actually a key way that you convey your, excellent performance, your knowledge of best practices and leadership. Most of the EMBA applications have very detailed recommendations, and so they're definitely not short. You might end up with a recommendation of about 1,400 words or so. There might be about 6 or 7 questions. They're normally pretty detailed in terms of, what is this person like as a leader? Give us an example. Um, do they have managerial potential? What are their weaknesses and how have they been addressing them? Will they be good as a student? Very detailed questions. And so they're going to need to really showcase how great you are, and then persuade the committee that if they bring you in the classroom again, that you're value added in the classroom, that you're going to be a very great presence. Now, this is all the more important if you have to use the recommendations as part of a strategy to offset a low GPA or a low GMAT score. So be sure, if that is your situation, you have a low GPA or a low GMAT score, that you pay particular attention to the recommendations. And in general, the recommendations count as heavily as the essays, if not more heavily, in the EMBA application process, because the schools really want to think that they're bringing in the stars. They look at your company and they're getting 20 candidates from your same company. They want to bring in the people that they think will move to the top of the company and the top of the industry. And the recommendations are a big part of how they perceive you in that regard. So mistakes number 8 and 9. These are the ones that we just felt we didn't want to leave out because they are important as well. Failing to time applications excellently. Now, this is important in particular based on your profile and also whether you have weaknesses. If you are a candidate who has a notable weakness, that can be low GPA, a low GMAT score, maybe some gaps in the employment, um, whatever that particular weakness is, you don't want to be applying at the very end of an admissions season for the EMBA because so many of the seats will be filled already that you're competing for a very small number. So, of course, the tendency will be to be bringing in the people that don't have those sorts of flaws. Now, if you have that sort of a weakness and you apply early, very good chance that you're going to maximize your odds of success. And again, with a very strong application, you have much better chance that the schools are going to ignore some of those soft spots in your profile. And so the weak candidate really needs to time things well to have a good outcome. The other thing is if you're overrepresented, then again, you need to think about timing. You don't want to be at the end. And so when I say overrepresented, it's simply in the pool of applicants. Who do they have so many, what profile is so abundant that they just don't want to admit super large numbers because it would kind of sort of take over the whole class. They want diversity in the class. People who are underrepresented will tend to be women, as well as ethnic minorities in the USA, whether it's African American or um, Latino. So those categories of profiles tend to be underrepresented. The overrepresented tend to be men, of course, and then, of course, men who are of East Asian or South Asian background. If it's foreign national, even more so, but even within the American pool, the American of Indian descent is the best way to say it. So the American who is of South Asian descent is still overrepresented in the pool. And so it just means that candidates of that profile need to think through very well the timing of the application. And for the foreign nationals in particular, getting in the earlier period is better. Now, one thing that does cause confusion is rolling admissions and rounds. So unlike most of the full-time programs at the EMBA level, you'll sometimes notice that a school has rounds for admissions, but they also are rolling at the same time. And so people are like, that doesn't make sense. So why do you have a deadline in round one, but it's rolling? So they may open September 30th, but the round one deadline is, say, November 30th. So the rationale is it's a couple things. Sometimes you're eligible for scholarships by the end of one round's deadline and not the other. Sometimes, as a foreign national, you need to get certain paperwork done, and so they want you to know when that end date might be. And so sometimes the rounds will correlate with that. But in general, if it's rolling admission, it's rolling admission regardless of whether there's actually a deadline for a round. And so the significance of the rolling admission is that the very day that they open, so say they open on September 30th to receive applications, means that they're going to start giving out seats not long after that. So whenever the first person was able to get the whole application complete, say it's a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, they're going to start to receive those applications, say in early October to mid-October. So for that school, you don't want to wait until the very last deadline, which might be April, to submit, because by then it's been months and months and months and months of admissions, so that when you're at the very end, most of the seats will be gone at that point. So your odds of success are much lower. So with rolling admissions in general, the earlier you get it in, the better. I still think for most people, if you hit the midpoint of that rolling process, you're probably still fine. Many profiles can be fine even applying quite late, but you just want to understand what the rolling admissions means is that they've been open to receive the applications from a very early point. And the benefit also of the rolling admission is that they will, when you submit, they'll review it not long after that. And typically in the EMBA process, you will know within a couple months, sometimes even 3 to 4 weeks, whether you are granted admission. And so it's a pretty fast process. They also sometimes want you to commit to them fast as well, so you have to be aware of that. But it's very nice that you don't have to wait, in most cases, 4 months to hear a response. It's pretty quick. So rolling admissions, keep it in mind and think about what timing will best serve you in terms of getting a great outcome. So now finally, the very last one that we wanted to mention was extracurricular credentials. In the scheme of things for the EMBA, the extracurriculars are not nearly as important as for the top full-time MBA programs. So, in general, if I get an EMBA candidate and they don't have much that they're doing, many times you can understand it. They've got a very demanding job and they have a family oftentimes, and so they just don't have time to be doing other things outside of that. Usually I'm not concerned about that. And, we will still try to help the candidate to build up because there's lots of ways that you can, augment and deepen your credentials in a very short time in a way that's high impact on the profile, as well as hopefully doesn't look like it's just being done at the last minute. And there's actually many ways to identify ways to build up someone quickly in that way. So we still go through that process. But for most candidates, it's a little bit less critical. The cases where it's very important are, again, if you have a notable weakness or two, it's just another way that you can redirect attention. So I had one candidate recently he had about a 1.8 GPA in college. And yet he had been elected recently, it's about 15 years later, to head up the industry organization, so the organization that kind of governs his industry. So he was just been elected president. Now that person, fantastic, because talk about redirecting attention. He not only has a successful company that he's running, that is his own company, but it's also that he's been now acknowledged as a big voice in the industry. So that is going to fully work for him in the admissions process. Again, when someone has that soft spot in the GPA or the GMAT score, we in particular at MBA Admit will be looking for ways to build up the extracurricular credentials so that that is redirecting attention and putting the balance toward the admissions committee wanting to say yes because the credentials are so strong. So do think about, what do you look like in your extracurricular credentials? Are they strong enough? One question we sometimes get is, does the undergraduate credential in terms of extracurriculars matter? And again, for some people, it's 15 years back in time. The answer is yes. Yes and no. No, it won't hurt you that you didn't have it because it's 15 years ago. And hopefully you can do things that are more recent that will fill what might be seen otherwise as a void in the extracurriculars. But otherwise, if you had strong credentials, you want to use that for you because now you have proof that in an academic setting, you actually will make a contribution. So you have a record that shows that. So you should showcase that in the application. So an example would be if someone had been president of the business club or a member of the student government or on the board of the Rotaract Club or playing a varsity sport like varsity football. Those are all relevant credentials. They should be presented because, again, it's your proof that in an academic setting you will contribute, and therefore you should be making the parallel that at the EMBA program you will contribute. Still better to still add on some things that are more recent, but don't neglect the ones that are in the past because those also can work for you. So that is the overview of mistakes to avoid. We also did a webinar a few weeks back about success practices for the EMBA. So hopefully between the two webinars, you will get a sense of things to do and things to avoid that can help you to build up and adapt your strategy and develop your strategy so that you get some great outcomes in the process. We are very happy to hear from you in the aftermath of this webinar, so feel free to contact us. You have our website address right there. Again, we're happy to do a profile evaluation for you, so if you'd like that to happen, you can go to our homepage and access the form there, submit it, and we will get back to you. But, the EMBA these days, just wonderful programs. You get wonderful degrees. As I think all you know, the degree that you get will say MBA and not EMBA. So on your resume, you will have an MBA from an outstanding school. It's a great path. Take a good look at it. we wish you the best as you go forward for those of you that decide to pursue this track. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you.